The wind cut through Dr. Taylor's thin jacket like it wasn't even there. Snow was falling harder now, big flakes that stuck to his scrubs when he rushed across the hospital parking lot. His breath made little clouds in the air as he hurried to his car, keys already in hand. Just 15 minutes ago, he'd been washing blood off his hands after saving a little boy's life. The child had come in with his parents, face pale and lips blue, his heart beating all wrong. Dr. Taylor had been about to leave after his regular 12-hour shift when the emergency call came in. Of course he stayed. That's what doctors do. 4 more hours won't kill me, he had told the night nurse with a tired smile. Little did he know those 4 hours would be some of the most intense of his career. The boy was only 7. His heart had nearly given out twice on the operating table, but Dr. Taylor refused to give up. His shoulders ached from standing so long, focusing so hard, but it was worth it. The look on the parents' faces when he told them their son would recover, that was why he became a doctor in the first place. Now, all Dr. Taylor wanted was his bed. 20 hours at the hospital was enough to drain anyone. He brushed snow off his windshield with his sleeve, not even bothering to look for a scraper. The cold bit at his fingers, making them stiff and clumsy as he unlocked his car door. Inside wasn't much better. The leather seats felt like ice through his thin scrubs, and he shivered as he turned the key. The car crumbled to life, reluctantly pushing out cold air that would take ages to warm up. Dr. Taylor checked his watch, 2:15 a.m. If traffic was kind, he might get 5 hours of sleep before his morning appointments. He turned on the radio, keeping it low. The soft piano music helped calm his mind after the intensity of the emergency room. His thoughts drifted to the boy, to the delicate work of repairing what had gone wrong in such a young heart. Dr. Taylor made a mental note to check on him first thing tomorrow. The hospital lights grew smaller in his rearview mirror as he drove through the quiet streets. The city looked different at night, peaceful under its blanket of fresh snow. Streetlights cast golden pools on empty sidewalks. Dr. Taylor rolled his shoulders, trying to work out the knots from standing over the operating table for so long. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, a text from his wife. "Is the boy okay? Are you coming home?" Even at this hour, she was waiting up, worrying about him and his patients. He smiled, feeling lucky despite his exhaustion. At the next red light, he typed back a quick message, "Boy stable. On my way now. Love you." The light turned green, and Dr. Taylor continued toward home, his mind already half dreaming of a hot shower and warm blankets. The roads were slippery, so he drove carefully, staying just at the speed limit. In his neighborhood, people knew him as the cautious one, the doctor who never took risks, not on the road, not in the operating room, not in life. He thought about tomorrow's schedule: 3 follow-up appointments, 2 consultations, and paperwork that never seemed to end. But first, he'd check on the boy, make sure those tiny repairs were holding, that the small heart was beating as it should. The falling snow was getting heavier, covering the road in white. Dr. Taylor turned the wipers up a notch and slowed down even more. Just a few more miles to go. His eyelids felt heavy, but the thought of home kept him alert. The dashboard clock read 2:32 a.m. when he saw the flashing lights behind him. Blue and red pulses reflected off the snow around him, lighting up his car interior like a disco. Dr. Taylor frowned, checking his speed. Definitely not speeding. Maybe a taillight was out. He signaled and pulled over to the side of the empty road, wondering what could be wrong. He had no idea that this simple traffic stop was about to change everything. Dr. Taylor pulled his car carefully to the side of the snow-covered road. The police cruiser's lights painted everything in flashes of blue and red. He turned down his music, took a deep breath, and waited for the officer to approach. In medical school, they taught him to stay calm in emergencies. This wasn't life or death, but the same skills would help now. He watched in the side mirror as the officer stepped out of the patrol car. Big guy, wide shoulders under a heavy winter coat. The officer took his time, boots crunching through fresh snow, flashlight beam sweeping across Dr. Taylor's license plate. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer called out before he even reached the window. Dr. Taylor placed both hands on the steering wheel, wondering why the officer sounded so tense for a routine traffic stop. When the window rolled down, cold air rushed in. The officer, his nameplate read Officer Daniels, shined the flashlight directly into Dr. Taylor's face, temporarily blinding him. "License and registration," Officer Daniels demanded, not bothering with a greeting or explanation for the stop. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Dr. Taylor asked politely, still blinking from the bright light. "License and registration first," the officer repeated, his tone hardening. "Then we'll get to your questions." Dr. Taylor nodded. "My registration is in the glove compartment and my wallet's in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for them now, okay?" The officer didn't respond, just kept the light trained on him. Dr. Taylor moved slowly, careful to telegraph each movement. As he handed over his license, his hospital ID badge came into view, clipped to his scrubs. Officer Daniels barely glanced at the medical credentials. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "Sir?" "It's freezing out there, and I'm only wearing." "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Something in the officer's voice told Dr. Taylor not to argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, immediately feeling the bite of the winter night through his thin scrubs. The wind had picked up, driving snow against his face as he stood by his car. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Dr. Taylor asked again, wrapping his arms around himself to keep warm. Officer Daniels circled him slowly, flashlight beam moving from head to toe. "Where are you coming from at this hour?" "The hospital. I just finished an emergency surgery. A little boy with a heart condition." Dr. Taylor pointed to his ID badge. "I'm a cardiologist at City Memorial." The officer smirked. "Right. And this is your car?" Dr. Taylor's confusion grew. "Yes, of course it's my car." "Seems like a pretty nice car for someone like you." The words hung in the air between them. Dr. Taylor felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "I don't understand. Someone like me." "Just answer the question," Daniels snapped. "How long have you owned this vehicle?" 3 years, Dr. Taylor replied, teeth beginning to chatter. "Officer, I've been standing in the snow for 5 minutes now. Could you please tell me why I was pulled over?" Instead of answering, Daniels walked back to his patrol car with Dr. Taylor's license and registration. The blue and red lights continued to flash, illuminating the falling snowflakes like colored stars. Dr. Taylor stood shivering, feeling exposed as occasional cars drove by slowly, passengers turning to stare at the scene. 10 minutes passed. His fingers had gone numb, and he couldn't feel his toes anymore. The thin surgical scrubs he wore under his light jacket offered almost no protection against the cold. He was a doctor. He knew the warning signs of hypothermia, and he was starting to show them. Finally, Officer Daniels returned, but instead of handing back Dr. Taylor's documents, he began to circle the car, inspecting it with exaggerated care. "Officer, please," Dr. Taylor said, his voice shaking from the cold. "I've been at the hospital for 20 hours. I'm exhausted. If there's a problem with my car or my driving, please just tell me." "We've had reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description," Daniels said, not looking at him. "Stolen? That's impossible. I have all the paperwork." "Hands up the hood," Officer Daniels interrupted, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Dr. Taylor stared in disbelief as snowflakes collected on his eyelashes. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not after saving a child's life tonight. But it was happening, and as he placed his trembling hands on the freezing metal of his carpet, he had a terrible feeling that this night was far from over. Dr. Taylor's hands burned with cold against the freezing metal of his car hood. Snowflakes landed on his back, melting through his thin scrubs, sending shivers down his spine. 20 minutes had passed since Officer Daniels first pulled him over. 20 minutes in the bitter cold with no explanation. "Officer, please," Dr. Taylor tried again, his voice steady despite his chattering teeth. "I've been standing out here for a long time now. I'm freezing." Officer Daniels circled the car slowly, deliberately, like a predator. "Cold, huh? Should have thought about that before you decided to drive around in a car like this." "I don't understand what you mean," Dr. Taylor said. "This is my car. I've shown you my registration." "Sure it is." The officer's flashlight beam hit Dr. Taylor's face again. "You know, we get all kinds in this neighborhood. People who don't belong." A passing car slowed down, passengers gawking at the scene, a black man in scrubs, hands on the hood of a luxury car, a police officer standing over him. The humiliation burned hotter than the cold. Dr. Taylor had worked his entire life to be respected, years of medical school, residency, building a reputation as one of the best cardiac surgeons in the state. None of that mattered now. "I live 3 miles from here," Dr. Taylor explained, trying to keep his dignity. "I was driving home from the hospital after performing emergency surgery." Officer Daniels laughed. "Right, and I'm the chief of surgery." He pulled out Dr. Taylor's hospital ID badge and examined it with exaggerated suspicion. "So you expect me to believe you're really a doctor?" "Yes, because I am. You can call the hospital if you don't believe me." "Oh, I'll be making some calls, all right." The officer smirked, but made no move to check Dr. Taylor's story. Instead, he walked around the car again, shining his light into every window, taking his time while Dr. Taylor stood shivering in the snow. A police dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Dr. Taylor couldn't make out the words, but Officer Daniels responded, "Got a situation here. Possible stolen vehicle. Subject claims to be a doctor." The way he emphasized the word doctor made it clear he didn't believe it. 30 minutes now. Dr. Taylor's fingers had gone completely numb against the hood. His legs felt weak. He knew the signs of hypothermia, confusion, exhaustion, slurred speech. He was a doctor, after all. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Officer, I'm starting to experience symptoms of cold exposure," he said, medical training kicking in. "I need to warm up soon, or this could become dangerous." "Dangerous? You worried about danger?" Officer Daniels stepped closer. "Should have thought about danger before you decided to drive around in a car you shouldn't have." Another car slowed down as it passed. This time, the driver rolled down their window, watching the scene unfold. More witnesses to Dr. Taylor's humiliation. He closed his eyes briefly, thinking of his patients, of the little boy whose heart he repaired hours ago. What would they think seeing their doctor like this? "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Officer Daniels demanded. Dr. Taylor opened his eyes, meeting the officer's gaze directly. Something shifted in that moment, not in Officer Daniels, but in Dr. Taylor himself. A lifetime of working within systems, of being twice as good to get half the credit, of swallowing indignities with a smile. Something finally gave way. "My name is Dr. Thomas Taylor," he said, voice stronger now despite the cold. "I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon at City Memorial Hospital. I just spent 4 hours saving a child's life. I have done nothing wrong, and I do not consent to being treated this way." Officer Daniels' face hardened. "Talking back now? That's not smart." "Neither is detaining a medical professional without cause in dangerous weather conditions," Dr. Taylor replied. "Your badge number is 8722. I can see it clearly, just like the dashboard camera in your vehicle can see everything happening right now." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Officer Daniels' face. He hadn't expected pushback from his target. He hadn't expected someone who knew their rights. "Turn around," the officer ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. "I think we need to continue this conversation at the station." Dr. Taylor's heart sank, but his resolve strengthened. Whatever happened next, he would remember every detail. This wouldn't be the end of things. Not by a long shot. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Dr. Taylor's wrists. 45 minutes had passed since the traffic stop began, and his body was now shaking uncontrollably from the cold. Even with his medical training, he couldn't stop the violent trembling. His fingers had gone from painful to warningly numb. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible through chattering teeth. "I need medical attention. This is hypothermia." Officer Daniels leaned against his patrol car, seemingly unbothered by the freezing temperature in his thick winter coat. "Funny how you keep playing doctor. Really committed to the role, huh?" A new set of headlights approached, slowing as they passed the scene. This time, the car pulled over about 50 feet ahead. Dr. Taylor felt a mix of shame and hope as an older man stepped out, bundled in a heavy coat. "Everything okay here, officer?" the man called out. "Police business," Officer Daniels replied sharply. "Please return to your vehicle, sir." The older man hesitated, looking at Dr. Taylor shivering in his scrubs, hands now cuffed behind his back. "Is that man in medical clothes? It's 15 degrees out here." "Sir, I won't tell you again. This is a police matter." The man took a reluctant step back but didn't leave. Instead, he pulled out his phone, holding it up where Officer Daniels could clearly see he was recording, just making sure everything's being done by the book. Something shifted in Officer Daniels' demeanor. The smirk faded, replaced by a tightness around his eyes. He walked over to Dr. Taylor and roughly turned him toward the patrol car. "You're free to go," he muttered, unlocking the handcuffs with quick, angry movements. "But I'm citing you for a broken taillight and failure to signal." Dr. Taylor rubbed his wrists, trying to restore circulation. "My taillights aren't broken, and I did signal. You calling me a liar?" Officer Daniels stepped closer, using his height to tower over Dr. Taylor. "I'm stating facts," Dr. Taylor replied quietly, aware of the witness still recording. "Just like it's a fact that you've kept me in dangerous weather conditions for nearly an hour without cause." Officer Daniels thrust a citation into Dr. Taylor's hands. "Sign it." With trembling fingers, Dr. Taylor took the paper but didn't sign. "I'll be reviewing this with my attorney." Big man with his big words. Officer Daniels sneered, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. He glanced at the bystander with the phone, then back at Dr. Taylor. "Get out of here before I change my mind." Dr. Taylor walked slowly to his car, legs numb and unsteady. Every step was a struggle. He was aware of how this looked, a proud man reduced to a stumbling, shivering mess. But something had broken free inside him during those long minutes in the cold. The humiliation had crystallized into resolve. Once inside his car, heat blasting, Dr. Taylor carefully wrote down everything that had happened while it was fresh in his mind. Badge number, time, exact words, the witness who had stopped to record. He noted the physical symptoms he'd experienced from prolonged cold exposure. Everything. When the older man knocked gently on his window, Dr. Taylor rolled it down slightly. "You okay, son?" the man asked. "I'm Joe. I saw what happened." "Thank you for stopping," Dr. Taylor said, his voice still unsteady. "Would you be willing to share that video?" Joe nodded, already planning on it. "Got his badge number too. That wasn't right, what he did to you." They exchanged information, and before driving away, Joe added, "You really a doctor?" "Cardiac surgeon," Dr. Taylor replied. "Was heading home after emergency surgery when he pulled me over." Joe shook his head. "My wife had heart surgery last year. Could doctors like you saved her life? This isn't how you should be treated." As Dr. Taylor finally drove toward home, the heaver slowly bringing feeling back to his extremities, he thought about his options. He could file a complaint that would probably go nowhere. He could try to forget it happened. Or he could do something that really mattered. His phone rang, the hospital. The little boy's condition had improved. His surgery was a success. In that moment, Dr. Taylor made his decision. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been humiliated on the side of a road. It was about making things right. He picked up his phone and called his cousin, the civil rights attorney. Dr. Taylor sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea warming his hands that still felt the ghost of the cold metal handcuffs. 3 days had passed since the traffic stop, but the memory remained fresh. The humiliation, the cold, the helplessness. His cousin Lee sat across from him, legal pad covered in notes. As a civil rights attorney, Lee had heard countless stories like this, but the personal connection made this one different. "So you've got the dashcam footage request submitted?" Dr. Taylor asked, sipping his tea. Lee nodded. "Filed it yesterday. By law, they have to preserve it now. And that witness's video is solid gold, shows the officer keeping you in the cold, the handcuffs, everything." Dr. Taylor rubbed his temples. He'd barely slept since that night. Between follow-up appointments with the young heart patient and replaying the incident in his mind, rest had been impossible. "I just keep thinking about what would have happened if Joe hadn't stopped to record," he said quietly. "But he did stop," Lee reminded him. "And now we have options. We could file a complaint against Officer Daniels, maybe get him suspended. But I'm thinking bigger." "What do you mean?" Lee slid a folder across the table. "I've been doing some digging. This isn't the first time Daniels has done something like this." Dr. Taylor opened the folder to find printouts of complaints against Officer Daniels, 12 in total over the past 3 years. All filed by people of color, all dismissed due to insufficient evidence. "How did you get these?" Dr. Taylor asked, scanning the documents. "I have contacts in the department, people who want things to change but need help from the outside. Lee leaned forward. This isn't about one bad officer, Tom. It's about a pattern. A system that lets this keep happening. Dr. Taylor thought about his hospital. When a doctor made the same mistake repeatedly, they didn't just get a warning. There were consequences, investigations, systemic changes to prevent it from happening again. Why should policing be any different? So what's the plan? He asked. We gather evidence, not just about your case, but all of these. Lee tapped the folder. We contact these people, see if they'll share their stories, and we find data, traffic stop numbers, demographic breakdowns, citation rates. Dr. Taylor nodded slowly. As a doctor, he appreciated this methodical approach. Diagnose the problem fully before attempting treatment. I have colleagues who've had similar experiences, he said. Nurses, technicians, even other doctors. People who've never filed complaints because they didn't think it would matter. Ask them if they'll talk to me, Lee said. Every story strengthens our case. That evening, Dr. Taylor made calls. First to his department head, explaining why he needed a few days off. Then to colleagues, friends, neighbors. With each conversation, a pattern emerged. So many had stories but had never spoken up, believing nothing would change. A week later, Dr. Taylor and Lee sat in a conference room with 8 others, healthcare workers, teachers, a retired judge, all with similar experiences. What had started as one humiliating traffic stop was becoming something much larger. The data is compelling, said a woman who taught statistics at the local university. She displayed charts showing Officer Daniels stopped minority drivers at 4 times the rate of his colleagues. This isn't random, it's targeted. And look at this, added a hospital administrator, pointing to a map dotted with colored pins. These are all the locations where people reported similar treatment. They cluster around 3 patrol zones, all under the same supervisor. Dr. Taylor studied the evidence they'd gathered. In medicine, he was trained to look beyond symptoms to find root causes. That's what they were doing now. So it's not just Officer Daniels, he said, the realization sinking in. No, Lee agreed. It's deeper. But that's good news, actually. Because now, we're not just filing a complaint about one incident. We're presenting evidence of a systemic problem that needs a systemic solution. As the meeting continued, Dr. Taylor felt something he hadn't experienced since that cold night: hope. The humiliation he'd suffered was becoming fuel for change. The doctor who healed hearts might help heal something in his community too. When his phone rang with the hospital's number, Dr. Taylor stepped out to take the call. The young heart patient was being discharged, fully recovered. Sometimes healing was possible, even when the damage seemed severe. He returned to the room with renewed determination. Let's take this to the oversight board, he said. All of it. The police department's community oversight boardroom was packed. Dr. Taylor straightened his tie and took a deep breath. It had been 3 weeks since that freezing night on the roadside, and now he stood ready to share not just his story, but the evidence of a much bigger problem. You have 10 minutes, said the board chairperson, a stern-looking woman with gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. Dr. Taylor nodded, then stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent. Behind him sat Joe, the man who had stopped to record that night, along with 15 others who had shared their own stories of mistreatment. Lee stood nearby, ready with the legal documents if needed. My name is Dr. Thomas Taylor, he began, his voice steady. 3 weeks ago, I was driving home after performing emergency heart surgery on a 7-year-old boy. I was pulled over by Officer Daniels of the 4th Precinct. He described what happened next, the freezing wait, the unfounded accusations, the handcuffs. No dramatic language, just facts. As a doctor, he'd learned that sometimes the simple truth was more powerful than any emotional appeal. I was forced to stand in 15-degree weather wearing only scrubs and a light jacket for 45 minutes, he continued. When I explained I was a doctor coming from surgery, Officer Daniels laughed and said, "Right, and I'm the Surgeon General." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Dr. Taylor clicked a button, and Joe's video played on the large screen. The footage was clear. Dr. Taylor shivering in the cold, the officer's dismissive attitude, the handcuffs. This isn't about one bad night or one officer's behavior, Dr. Taylor said as the video ended. This is about a pattern. He displayed the charts they'd prepared, traffic stop data, citation rates by race, complaint statistics. The room grew quieter with each slide. In the past 3 years, Officer Daniels has stopped minority drivers at 4 times the rate of other officers in his precinct. Citations issued to these drivers were 3 times more likely to be dismissed in court, suggesting they weren't legitimate to begin with. A board member leaned forward. "How did you get this data?" "Public records requests," Lee answered from the side. "Everything here is legally obtained information that the department already has but hasn't analyzed in this way." Dr. Taylor continued, showing the map with pins representing similar incidents. "These aren't isolated cases. They represent a systemic issue that requires a systemic solution." As he spoke, Dr. Taylor noticed a figure at the back of the room. The police chief himself had slipped in quietly. Their eyes met briefly before Dr. Taylor turned back to the board. "As a doctor, I'm required to keep detailed records of everything I do. My surgeries are recorded. My decisions are reviewed. If I make a mistake, there are consequences, but more importantly, there are changes to prevent similar mistakes in the future." He gestured to the people behind him. "These citizens deserve the same accountability from their police department. We're not here to attack officers. We're here because we believe in good policing. We believe things can be better." A local reporter in the front row was frantically taking notes. Dr. Taylor hadn't planned on media attention, but now he welcomed it. Sunlight was the best disinfectant. "We have 3 specific recommendations," he said, nearing his conclusion. "First, a review of Officer Daniels' conduct and appropriate disciplinary action. Second, mandatory body cameras with penalties for non-compliance. And third, an independent review of traffic stop data every quarter to identify and address patterns of bias." The chairperson's timer beeped. "Your time is up, Dr. Taylor." "Thank you for listening," he said, gathering his materials. As he stepped away from the podium, a board member raised her hand. "Before you go, Dr. Taylor, that boy you operated on, how is he doing?" The unexpected question caught him off guard. Dr. Taylor smiled for the first time that evening. "He went home yesterday. Full recovery expected." The board member nodded. "Thank you for your service, both as a doctor and as a citizen today." As Dr. Taylor returned to his seat, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a nurse at the hospital. "Your story just hit the local news website. We're all behind you." The police chief was now approaching the podium, looking grim but determined. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and people were watching. 6 months had passed since that cold night on the roadside. Dr. Taylor stood before a room of fresh-faced police cadets, their uniforms crisp, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. This wasn't where he'd expected to find himself when he'd first felt those handcuffs bite into his wrists. "The most important tool you have isn't your gun or your badge," he told them, pacing slowly across the front of the classroom. "It's your judgment, your ability to see the person in front of you as a human being first." After his presentation to the oversight board, things had moved quickly. The dashboard camera footage had confirmed everything: 45 minutes in freezing weather, the dismissive treatment, the unfounded accusations. Combined with Joe's video and the statistical evidence, it had been impossible to ignore. Officer Daniels had been suspended, then fired after the full investigation revealed a history of similar incidents. But Dr. Taylor hadn't stopped there. "I could have walked away satisfied after that one officer lost his job," he told the cadets. But that wouldn't have fixed the real problem. Instead, he'd formed a community action committee with Lee and others from the oversight board meeting. They'd pushed for policy changes, mandatory body cameras, better training, quarterly reviews of traffic stop data. Most importantly, they'd created this: a special training program where community members shared their experiences directly with officers. "When Officer Daniels pulled me over that night, he didn't see a doctor who'd just saved a child's life," Dr. Taylor continued. "He saw his own assumptions, his own biases. That's what I want you to understand today." A cadet raised her hand. "But how do we know when our concerns are legitimate versus when we're acting on bias?" Dr. Taylor smiled. It was the question he hoped for. "Good question. That's why we developed these scenario-based trainings you'll be doing next week. Real situations where officers had to make judgment calls. You'll get to practice seeing the difference." The police chief, who had initially been defensive at the oversight board meeting, now stood at the back of the room, nodding along. Their relationship had evolved from adversaries to unlikely allies. Both wanted the same thing: a department that protected and served everyone equally. After the session ended, Dr. Taylor checked his watch. He had surgery in an hour, a valve replacement for an elderly patient. Life had returned to normal in many ways, yet everything had changed. Dr. Taylor called a voice as he headed for the exit. He turned to find a young cadet hurrying after him. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "My brother was stopped 3 times last year for driving while black. What you're doing here, it matters." Dr. Taylor nodded, unexpectedly moved. "Just doing what anyone would do." "But that's just it," she replied. "Most people don't. They suffer in silence or get angry, but never channel it into change. You did something different." Outside, the spring air felt sweet after the stuffy classroom. Dr. Taylor thought about that freezing night, how helpless and humiliated he'd felt. The memory would always sting, but it had lost its power to hurt him. His phone buzzed, a text from the hospital. His young heart patient was coming in for his 6-month checkup tomorrow. The boy who'd indirectly set this whole journey in motion was thriving. As Dr. Taylor drove to the hospital, he passed the spot where he'd been pulled over that winter night. The police department had changed: new leadership, new policies, new training. The quarterly data showed fewer complaints, more community engagement, better outcomes for everyone. One traffic stop hadn't changed the world, but it had changed one department, one community, one small corner of a system that needed fixing. And maybe, just maybe, those cadets would carry these lessons to departments across the country. Dr. Taylor pulled into his parking space at the hospital, white coat already waiting in his office. His hands, the same hands that had been cuffed in the cold, would save another life today. Some wounds healed others. Some humiliations became fuel for change. And sometimes justice worked exactly as it should. In the end, Dr. Taylor had learned what he'd always told his patients: healing takes time, it takes work, and it leaves scars, but it's always, always worth it.